Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to explore gender equality in literature with you today. Before we get started, I wanted to give you guys a minute to think about your own ideas about gender and its role in character development. Here, I am giving you a list of traits that are from famous fictional characters, and I want you to guess whether the character was male or female. We know that gender is partly a social construction, meaning that we learn about it through interaction. So we know how girls are supposed to act by watching how girls and women act, and we know, and the same for men. We know how men are supposed to act by watching boys and men. And reading plays into this as well. We see characters that behave a certain way, and their gender may determine in the story their response to a scenario. So it may help you that all of these characters are classic characters. That means this was written quite a while ago. So go ahead and make a guess. And again, these aren't turned in. There's no grade here. It's just simply to explore what type of characteristics we think are given to male characters versus what type of characteristics we think are given to female characters. So I'll go ahead and give you guys a minute, and later we will reflect on what we found. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to begin with just a brief introduction of what Refocused publishing is. Refocused literature begins with the premise that all genders are equal, period. To test and demonstrate this premise, I'm excited to show you how we use classic literature to expose gender bias and experience gender equality. Our mission is to advance equality and representation of genders in literature. We do this by refocusing classic literature to represent different genders from the original work. So what that means is that we are going to take male characters could become female characters can become male characters. If everyone is equal, then we are all interchangeable. This leads to some pretty amazing things, but we'll get to that throughout the lecture. What we're aiming for is engagement with the concept of gender equality. What does the world look, sound, feel like when all genders are equal and therefore they are all interchangeable? Fictional characters give us an easy way to test this concept. And what we have found is that biases become much easier to identify, and we receive representation of male and female characters that perhaps we have been lacking. Women can be depicted as strong, men can be kind. Look, these people exist in the real world already. We all know strong women. We all know kind and empathetic men. And at Refocused Publishing, we want to see them represented in our literature as well. So who am I and why am I doing this? I was raised in a big family. I'm one of 5 kids. We grew up in the Chicagoland area. I trained for the Olympics until high school in luge. So I ended up missing quite a few years of school. My schooling before high school consisted of my mother mailing me worksheets and me completing them and mailing them back, and her sending me books, lots and lots of books, mostly the classics. So I think that that's where my love of classic literature has come from. Most of my schooling up until high school subsisted of reading classic works. I eventually went to a public high school. I ended up going to the University of Notre Dame, where I got a double major in philosophy and accounting. I went on to DePaul University to get my MBA and became a CPA. I worked at big companies like KPMG and Harley Davidson. I worked at startups and other entrepreneurial ventures. Eventually, I became an adjunct professor teaching taxes and accounting. While doing all this, I was also a mother. I have 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. And it is when I began rereading the classics with them that I found myself stopping and saying, oh, this gender bias is wrong. And I wanted to stop and talk about it at all the different places. And as a teacher at that time, I began thinking about enfolding gender equality into my lessons. but there just wasn't a lot of resources out there. So I set about to create some, right? And the classics give us a wonderful way. They are well written, they are great characters, but they are full of bias. And they give us a starting point to start having these conversations and recognizing it in our own lives. So I created Refocus Publishing. We began publishing Refocused works. And I put a quote here: I alone cannot change the world, but I can cast a stone across the waters to create many ripples. And that's really what I am hoping. I'm throwing a stone here in hopes that we begin having conversations that lead to a decrease in gender polarization and an acceptance of all genders' abilities to incorporate all characteristics, that people can be who they are and not have to be defined by their gender. That gender stops being a trajectory in fictional characters' developments, but also in our own developments. Like we talked about, gender is a social construction, so we all agree on what gender is and how it behaves and what it's allowed to do and not allowed to do. And I'm hoping that we can start to agree that genders are equal, therefore interchangeable. So very quickly, let's look at the logic behind doing this experiment. Before you is an argument. An argument is made up of premises that logically lead to a conclusion. An argument is sound if the premises are true. A argument is valid if they logically lead to that conclusion. So let me give you an example really quick. Sorry, I had to pull my philosophy degree in here somewhere. A valid argument would be if you had two premises: one, everything in space is made of cheese, and two, the moon is in space. The conclusion would be, therefore, the moon is made of cheese. This is a valid argument. The two premises logically lead to the conclusion, but it is not a sound argument because the premises are not true. The moon is in space, that is true, but not everything in space is made of cheese. So let's go ahead and look at our premises really quick and make sure that we agree that they are true. Premise number one: all genders are equal. And specifically in this case and how we're using gender, we're going to look that all genders are equally human. So we take this to be true because it doesn't matter if you're a man, a woman, non-binary, whatever gender you identify with, you are a human. So we know that this is true. Premise number two: human traits are not exclusive to one gender or another. There have been many studies that find that traits can be socially believed to be generally more for one gender or generally more for another, but that there is no trait that is limited to one gender. So there's nothing that we can think of that says, oh, well, this trait, kindness, intelligence, strength, passionate, all those things we looked at before. None of them are only for one gender or another. Premise number three: I'm throwing a little math at you. I know you thought this was a lecture about literature and we're talking philosophy and now some math, but bear with me. Equal parts are interchangeable. So, if A equals B and B plus C is D, then we know that A plus C will also equal D, right? This is just some basic logic in there. So we take that premise to be true too. So the conclusion: therefore, all genders equally fit depictions of human beings. As long as a character is human, their traits can be encompassed by any gender. And after doing this for a little while, we find this absolutely to be true. So far, there has not been a character that we refocused that was like, oh, we didn't realize men or women couldn't do this or be this. And we absolutely had examples in the real world of people who we knew who encompassed those traits that were given to those characters. So, all right, hope you're still with me. Let's get going. So here's an example of refocused literature from Antigone. In this excerpt, we have a steel-clad warrior, um, riding on the battlefield. So they're really short. Let's go ahead and just read them both and see what you think. He rode, reverting his pale shield, headlong from yonder battlefield. In snow-white panoply on eagle wing, he rose, dire ruin on our land to bring. Roused by the fierce debate of Polyneices' hate, shrilling sharp menace from his breast, sheathed all in steel from crown to heel, many a plumed crest. In the refocused version, she rode, reverting her pale shield, headlong from yonder battlefield. In snow-white panoply on eagle wing, she rose, dire ruin on our land to bring. Roused by the fierce debate of Polyneices' hate, shrilling sharp menace from her breast, sheathed all in steel from crown to heel, many a plumed crest. So basically, we are keeping the text as similar to the original as possible, and we are just changing the gender to see what effect it has on the character. So now that you have a small idea of what we're doing, here are the texts that were refocused in 2020. Every year, the texts that become refocused into a different gender are pushed together and published. So this year we had The Golden Bird, which was one of Grimm's fairy tales, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, The Ransom of Red Chief, two of Shakespeare's sonnets, Antigone, The Most Dangerous Game, and The Lady of the Tiger. So these are the texts that I'm going to be using to look at what we found when we refocused these books. So we're going to start by looking at how do you refocus a text, and we're going to look at the different steps it takes together. So here are the 4 steps that it takes to refocus a piece of literature. Step 1 is to choose a text. If this is a thought experiment, there is no right or wrong text. You can think about any book, show, movie in reverse, all that you want. For Refocused publishing and what we want to do with the refocused literature, we're going to look at why classic literature is a good choice for us. Step 2 is you need to choose a gender that you wish to refocus it to. Step 3 is addressing the obstacles that come up after doing this for a while. There are some things that we have found that we stumble over, and we'll talk about those issues. And step 4 is to analyze the text. And this is the really exciting part, because we have found that biases become very obvious, ridiculous. They're much easier to see when you're looking at it through a refocused lens. And what's really surprising is that we found gender representations that have been powerfully changed. There are missing representations in our entertainment that this helps to flush out. You see a character and, oh my goodness, we haven't seen this, and it's very powerful to see it that way. Every story is different. You really don't know what you're going to find. Every time I've gone into it being like, well, we're going to see this, we find something new and different and powerful in the text. So we're going to look at analyzing it and how we can understand it in the new refocused version. So the first thing that we want to do is to choose a text. There is nothing wrong to look through any TV, movie, book through a refocused lens. I strongly recommend it, but for our purposes at Refocused Publishing, we need to pick texts that are in the public domain. We would get into a lot of legal trouble if we tried to publish books that where simply we had changed the gender. So classic literature is a great pick for us. It's also a great pick because this is something that people are continuing to read. They're continuing to want to look at these stories, and it's obviously connecting to our era still. So classic literature, things that are still being taught in classrooms, is a great place for us to start. The next thing, is the lesson theme relevant? Not always. I think it's a little bit shocking. One of the first stories that we did was The Golden Bird, and this is one of Grimm's fairy tales. It's still taught in classrooms for that purpose, to show the different characteristics of a fairy tale, all the different pieces, and this story has them all. So it's still taught. The theme is not so relevant, but it was very eye-opening to refocus this book. It had two of the things that we keep stumbling over again and again when we refocus work, and that's one, it was not gender balanced. There was many more male characters. Even the magical creatures in the story were male. There was only one female character, and she was not depicted as human. She did not react to situations and scenarios the way that a human being would react. So those next two, is the text gender balanced, and how are the genders depicted? We really saw that in The Golden Bird. In the Ransom of Red Chief and The Most Dangerous Games, both of those had no female characters. So once it was refocused, there were no male characters. And these classics have been taught in classrooms for generations. I was taught these, maybe you have also been taught them. And never have I heard a student raise their hand and say, hey, there were no women in this story. And yet that was the overwhelming response we got when we gave people the refocused version, is that, hey, there's no men in here. It seems very noticeable to our generation to not have men in our stories. I think it says something about their generation that they wrote stories that didn't have women in them, but I think it says something about ours that we only notice when a gender is missing once it has been refocused. So when we look at our media, when we look at our entertainment, it is still very much male lead dominated, right? There will be women in there, but they will have a smaller part. Sometimes they still act in ways that are not necessarily human. They don't respond to situations the way a human being would. Although I think that is getting less and less. So we do need to think about that, right? It should be weird that any gender is missing from our entertainment. And we should notice it all the time. That being said, I want to take a minute to remind everyone that we are learners here. Everyone is here to learn and to examine. There's no reason you should be hard on yourself if, when you're looking at refocused text, you come across a gender bias that you might have had, whether good or bad, right? Biases can go either way, but you may find yourself being like, wow, I didn't realize I thought that. And that is one of the great things about refocused literature, is that it gives you that ability to examine your own beliefs. I had a student once who really struggled with refocusing a character of a landscaper. For some reason, a landscaper in their head was male, and when they wrote the landscaper she, it seemed wrong, and they just kept being like, there's something wrong here. And when we talked about it, he was like, well, of course a woman could be a landscaper. There's no reason a woman couldn't be a landscaper. And that was just something that they had stumbled over. And it was, realizing that they had that bias, that given a job, they would associate a gender, helped them to look at it and to realize that was, not necessarily always true. So, when we're looking at refocused literature, we want to make sure that we are honest with ourselves and that we realize it's okay to understand that we have biases. I am still a learner. I am still looking to learn and to grow. I love that the younger generation has a much broader understanding. And as we go to say that genders are not determinative of who we are, I think it is wonderful that they continue to expand. So be gentle and kind to yourself, and know that it's okay to stumble across biases that you may have. And just, that's what we're doing this for, to look at them and to hopefully eliminate them. So we want to look at classic literature. We want to, but we don't only want to look at texts that are unbalanced, that or where genders are depicted as only stereotypes. I actually have found that the stories that are more gender balanced, where you have male characters acting like human beings and female characters acting like human beings, come up with some amazing, amazing results. And what we find is that you get representations of genders that we rarely see, right? So if we go back to that first image where we had the steel-clad warrior, right? You may have responded to the female image stronger than the male image because this is a rarer image, right? We don't see female warriors. And so it may have resonated with us, or we may have paid more attention to it because it was rare. And you'll find that, like, while you're refocusing something, you'll say, oh my goodness, this is a really compelling and powerful character. Why don't we see that more often? So let's go ahead and we'll keep moving. And I promise we'll look at some of those wonderful representations. So here's an excerpt from Antigone. Refocused. It was one of the amazing things that we found. I don't think we necessarily knew that we were going to come across this, but once we read the refocused version of this text, it was truly powerful. In this scene, the king has just learned of his daughter's death, and we see the chorus, we see society showing concern for his mental health. I think in our entertainment, in our literature, we don't see this very often. In the real world, men do love their children just as much as women, and we don't always see that depicted. But even where still, we don't see societal concern for their mental health. Prince Harry has started talking out about this. We're starting to see some signs that this is important, but we do need to see it in the stories that we tell as well. And that's why I think this scene is so powerful. The refocused version of a gender balanced text where both men and women are behaving as human beings allows us to see people in roles in society that we are rarely shown, but yet we know exist. In the real world, the loss of a child should cause societal concern for both the mother and the father. Men have committed suicide over the loss of a child. And refocused literature helps us to see the spaces that have been underrepresented in the way that we tell our stories. When we refocus it, these spaces where mothers get to be good parents and get to feel love, we need to see men in those roles. And I think that this is one of the truly important things that refocusing literature and looking at that text helps us to see, is those underrepresented areas of being a human. Okay, I'm getting emotional. Let's pull it back here to look at the characteristics we examined when we started out. So I may have misled you a little bit in thinking that these were all different fictional characters, when actually these are all characteristics of Romeo from Romeo and Juliet. Romeo is a complex character, and I think that this is one of the main ways that looking at refocused literature helps to reinforce gender equality. There are no human characteristics that are only male or only female. And these complex characters, you know, the ones that end up making it into classic literature that we still are talking about, these complex characters are made up of characteristics that fall all over the continuum. I bet that most of you had checked both male and female categories, that no one ran down this and said, oh, only men would be these things, right? So what happens when we refocus a character like this? Well, not a lot. They continue to be human. Their characteristics simply may be on the opposite side of the scale if we are keeping track, but really they just continue to play the same role in the story that they had originally played. Good characters are not stereotypes. They are like us. They're complex. We are all made of sometimes contradictory characteristics. And so this is one of the great things about looking at refocused literature is that we find that characters that are human remain human. And this reinforces our belief that this is a great way to look at it, and it is a great way to confirm our beliefs about gender equality. And what we are left with is a great story that, you know, like we just looked at, gives us representations in literature that we have been missing. And it also kind of flushes out some of those biases that may be in there. We're going to look next at some examples of how those biases appear once they are refocused, and it really does make them very obvious and makes it so we can say, hey, this is not, you know, a true statement about a human being. This is just a bias. So let's go ahead and look at those. First thing you're going to notice that I have highlighted here is that in the refocused version, the names do not change. And this is so that if someone reads the original and someone reads the refocused version, they can still have a discussion about it. We're always going to know who did what. So in refocused literature, the names do not change. To borrow from Shakespeare, what's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, right? So the names stay the same whether you change the genders or not. So let's go ahead and look at this. I'm going to read the original really quick. Just at daybreak, I was awakened by a series of awful screams from Bill. They weren't yowls or howls or shouts or whoops or yaps such as you'd expect from a manly set of Vocaborians. They were simply indecent, terrifying, humiliating screams such as women emit when they see ghosts or caterpillars. It's an awful thing to hear a strong, desperate, fat man scream incontinently in a cave at daybreak. So I don't think that we needed to refocus this text for modern readers to kind of wince at the biases that were there. You know, when we look at this, he's referring to women in general. General sweeping statements are almost always wrong, right? You're not going to say anything about a group really and not have it be full of bias and not be true for some members. But looking more closely at it, you know, we can see that this is an attempt at a joke. He's taking this bias that women scream at insects and at, you know, irrational fears, and, you know, pushes it to the next level of caterpillars and ghosts. And in this, you know, it's a pretty obvious bias, and it's not funny, right? We look at the refocused version and it just seems wrong. And I don't think we needed to see it refocused to know that it was always wrong. So when we're looking at biases, a great way to think about it is, if I looked at it for myself or my own group, is it, you know, is it true? Because any group of humans are going to have the same characteristics, maybe some more this way, some more that way, but you're never going to be able to make a sweeping statement. So if you're saying something about a group that doesn't seem like a human would do it, you're probably dehumanizing that group and perpetuating a bias against it. But this was a very obvious example. I don't think we needed to refocus it. I want to look at a less obvious example and see how refocusing sometimes opens our eyes to the biases, you know, the unconscious biases, the ones we may not have noticed that we were buying into. So here's an excerpt from The Legend of Sleepy Hollow Refocused. One of the reasons that I refocused The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was because of the complex character of the Black Crane. In the original, he is a man who is looking for the easy life by marrying money. Throughout the book, he is ridiculed for being thin and intelligent. So I thought it would be very interesting to see how refocusing this text would would come across. And here's a part that we got. The countryman of Crane was not inequitable to his person. He was tall but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms, and legs. To see him striding along the profile of the hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine and descending upon the earth, or some scarecrow eloped from a cornfield. So here we see the author trying to detract from Ichabod's character by by his physical description. He's basically body shaming him. Whereas when we read the Refocused version, we can see how wrong that rarely do we talk about women being thin with long legs and flowing clothes and mean it in a detracting way. And this really identifies the gender polarization that still exists in our society. So in the 70s, there was a researcher named Sandra Bem who looked at, who coined the term gender polarization. So basically when societies say, this is how women look and act, and it is the polar opposite of how men look and act. And this, so if we say women must look this way and act this way, and men must look this way and act this way, we are increasing gender polarization. But what happened when she went out to the real world to test this, it is very hard to enforce in the real world. In fact, almost everyone fell again on this continuing characteristic. She could not find, there would be very feminine women, there would be very masculine men, but for the most part, people had characteristics that fell into both categories. I don't know why we were categorizing them or why we do, but so human beings, although we see this in our entertainment, human beings tend not to have just characteristics of one gender or another. We tend to be human. We have characteristics all across the continuum. Basically, once we accept that genders do not have different characteristics, we can start to decrease that gender polarization, and we can stop shaming people for being human. There are thin men and thin women, and the opposite is true as well. There's no reason to shame anyone. And I think that looking at literature through this refocused lens helps us to accept that there is no, it is never right to shame anyone for any characteristic that they may have, because it is not in line with their gender. Okay, so now we have some idea of what we might find when we're refocusing a text, and that helps us to choose a good text that we want to refocus. Once we've chosen the text, we start the process of refocusing it, and the first thing we want to do is choose what gender. So far in 2020, we have reversed male and female genders completely, but it does not need to be limited to that. So choosing who in the story you wish to refocus, or if you wish to refocus the entire text, is the next step. We're going to try and keep the text as similar to the original as possible, and that lets us analyze it in contrast with the original. We are only going to change the words that have a gender identity, and the biggest change we're going to see is in the pronouns. So let's look back at that first piece of text that I showed you here, back with that steel-clad warrior. We can see that the only changes that have happened to the text are the pronouns, and that's pretty easy. So after doing this for a while, there are some obstacles that we have fallen over and made some decisions about, and I'd like to share those with you. So the biggest thing to replace is the pronouns, and you cannot use find and replace. I know we have tried. So looking at this chart, you can see that her can be replaced with him or his. His can be replaced with her or hers. There is not a great way to find and replace all these items. And plus, you're going to have to use your own knowledge of the English language to make tiger into tigress and witch into warlock. So you're really going to have to close read in order to refocus it to another gender. The next area, especially when you're working with older texts, you may come across words that denote only one gender and do not have an opposite gender equivalent. So one of those words that we ran across was knight errant. A knight errant was an aristocrat who was out looking for chivalrous adventures. These would all have been men. And so to answer how to deal with these types of words, we kind of looked to science fiction and how they have incorporated these terms. And what they have done is to just make the terms inclusive. You might see them put female, so the female knight errant, or you might see just the knight errant Lucy, knowing that that character would be female. And so this fit in line with our ideas of inclusivity. And so if you come across a word that does not have a gender equivalent, it's about time to just include all genders in it. So we're going to just be inclusive. That being said, you will come across areas where it is said man or men, and it is meant as all of mankind, all of humankind. There we do refocusing. If one gender can encompass all of humanity, there is no reason that the other gender can't do it as well. So we do refocus those words. And finally, poetry. Poetry, there's rhythm, there's sound, there's meter, there's rhyme. Poetry can be one of the hardest things to refocus. And let's go ahead and look at one of the sonnets that we refocused in 2020. So here is Sonnet 130 Refocused. I have highlighted every single word that I changed. So when working with poetry, you have to think about the rhythm, the meter, the rhyme, the sound. And so luckily, most of the pronouns are one syllable. That helps a lot, since those are the biggest ones you're changing. But the original says, my mistress's eyes. And so I had to find something. Mistress, it's two syllables, and lover is what I came with. But you have to be creative. You have to try and keep the author's authentic voice. You can see in this one, I changed the object of affection from a woman to a man. So poetry has its own complications, but I think it's worth it. So the fourth and final step is to analyze the refocused text. So now that you've created this wonderful text, it's time to look at it and see what the refocused lens has shown us. So where is the gender bias made obvious and ridiculous? And not just the gender bias that we knew about before reading it, but maybe those unconscious biases that we didn't realize and were wrong, that now we can see more clearly. Where is the gender representation powerfully changed, right? Where are there strong women and good fathers and those types of representations that we may be lacking? In The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, one of the characters, when it was refocused, became a woman, and she was a lovable prankster, although I'm not sure I liked her very much, but that idea of a prankster female, I had a hard time thinking of an example of that. Where are these missing representations in our literature, in our stories? Did this text make you think about the text differently, right? Did you notice that a gender was missing all of a sudden? Did the story, message, or theme or meaning change? Most likely not. If it had human characters and they were flipping, they still played the same role in the story. But it's a good thing to look at. So that is the final step. So that's basically it on how to refocus a text. I hope that you have been able to experience gender equality a little more authentically. I hope that I have given you a tool to look at gender bias by refocusing it, looking at it from the opposite perspective, that perhaps you have a way to identify it in your own life, that I've given you a concrete step to increase gender equality and gender representation in literature, and that you are able to see the world differently and look at other and consider other perspectives. But really, really my big takeaway that I hope you leave is that you start considering gender bias in the stories that you tell. So if you're relating your experiences, if you're writing a book, if you're making a screenplay, that you consider these biases and make sure that if your work was refocused, you wouldn't be stumbling over them. I want you to realize that you have the ability to change social constructions of gender. The way that you act will reinforce how men act, how women act, and hopefully that decreases gender polarization, and we start accepting that all characteristics can belong to any gender. That eventually the classics that are being written now, that are coming out of our time, will not need to be refocused in the future. Thank you so much for being with me. I enjoyed my time with you here. I hope you have enjoyed it as well. So go out there and refocus some text. If you want some text to refocus, to be included in Refocus Publishing's offerings, you can go out to refocuspublishing.com and click on Get Involved, and there will be text there for you to refocus.